All right, we're here with Mick West from Metabunk. And before I get started, I just wanted to ask you, how much were you paid by the New World Order to have this conversation with me?
Nothing. In fact, I'm losing money by being here.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah,
Not a lot, not a lot.
I,
But
uh,
no.
I thought maybe your last name was Shill because every time I search for Mick West, there's always a video next to it that someone's calling you a shill. It's
Yeah, I think that
hilarious.
they put that as my middle name usually. I don't have a middle name, so yeah, I guess
Well,
I could take that one. But no, I'm not a shield. Nobody pays me. I'm a retired computer programmer. I used to be a video game programmer, and I retired. I've got enough money to live on, so I just do this because it's fun.
well, and I think that what you're doing is awesome because there's so much stuff out there now on the internet. It's really good to have a site like yours where you can go and reference it and not be fooled. There's a lot of misinformation out there now, and it seems like it's really hard to figure out what the truths are.
Oh
So,
yeah, yeah, definitely.
yeah,
Now more than ever, I think.
yeah, exactly. And especially with the flat earth, I I work in a cabinet shop, and we just hired a new guy, and he is a fundamentalist Christian and a flat earther, and which is crazy because I'm neither of those things in the highest regard. And so I did a podcast with my wife about 6 months ago, and we talked about the flat earth theory and just kind of debunked it or whatever. And it hasn't really resurfaced in my head until the last couple of weeks, which is one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you. It's been on my mind a lot lately. And when we first looked into it, we went to your website for a lot of information, and I kind of came up with an idea of what I think is going on, and I wanted to run it by
Mhm.
you. So I think what's going on is, because it's not like the flat earthers are stupid. It's not like they're unintelligent people. I mean, they're definitely not physicists or anything like that. But
They're
there's
average people, I think. I think that's what I normally think of. Any conspiracy theorist, like a group of conspiracy theorists, like on average, they tend to be, just the same range of people you get in any other thing. Like if you take a cross section of people who go to football games, you're going to get some stupid people, you're going to get some smart people. So it's going to be the
right.
same type of thing. They're ordinary people.
Yeah. And it seems like what I think is going on is, I mean, I don't know. I think it seems like a lot of it comes from religion. And it's like
Yeah.
people are either they were religious before, and it seems like the next thing that they move on to is conspiracy, or B, they're using the conspiracy to try to justify religion. And it seems like, to the biggest extremes with the flat earth theory, it seems like some of the people that I've spoken with that are flat earthers and they're basing it off of Christianity,
Mhm.
it's almost like they're so rational. They've come to this point where they realize that modern day science cannot go along with religion. So in order for religion to be true, all of science has to be fake. And
Yeah.
it's almost like this justification to continue believing in religion for someone who otherwise would be rational enough to realize that it doesn't make sense. And I don't know, that's just something I've been thinking about, especially with this coworker. I mean, he thinks NASA's faked everything. The moon landings are fake, anything science related. I asked him about, where the sun goes at night behind the mountains, according to the Bible. And it's like, it's almost like, he's looked into this so much that in order to continue with his religion, he has to have a big conspiracy, because there's either the religion isn't true, or B, everybody's lying and the religion is true.
Yeah, yeah,
So
no, that makes sense. I think a lot of people who are religious, they kind of separate their religion from science.
right.
Like if you ask religious people if they believe in the supernatural, they'll generally tell you no, because they think of the supernatural as being things like witches and demons and things like that. And most religious people
Sure.
don't believe in that. They don't believe in magic, but they do believe in like a God in heaven who created everything, and they believe in miracles. and they believe that when they die, they will go to heaven. So on the one hand, they got this scientific belief where they don't believe in miracles and in things like magic. But on the other hand, they do believe in the supernatural. And there's these two divisions. They're referred to as, I think Stephen Jay Gould talked about it, and he called them magisteria. Not sure what that means exactly. And the term he uses, which is
like hysteria and magic put together? Is that what he's going for?
It's like I don't know, like realms of knowledge or something like that.
Sure.
So there's these two magisteria, and one of them is religion, and one of them is science, and they don't overlap for most people. So you can believe in them simultaneously, even though they kind of conflict. And he's got this term called NOMA, N-O-M-A, non-overlapping magisteria. It's a bunch of technical philosophical stuff. But I think with the people who, the flat earth people who are religious, they're overlapping. So they have to apply their religion to all of science, and then they get these conflicts. And because they've got these conflicts, they've got to try to resolve them. And the only way they can resolve them is by going deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole of irrational ways of looking at the world in terms of it being flat. They think that the Bible says that the world is flat, therefore it has to be flat. Therefore, they have to come up with some explanation for it, even though it's at odds with science, and that way leads to conspiracy, obviously, because all the scientists would have to be covering it up. But yeah, it's this where things that are normally separate have come together, and then they mess everything up when they get together.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. I've noticed, like, even for myself, I definitely used to be a conspiracy theorist, not to that extreme, which is kind of the point I'm about to make. But I used to think for sure 9/11 was an inside job. I used to think that I used to think that maybe aliens were a thing, but because of time travel and how long our perception of time would be relative to their time and space traveling, I thought maybe they just haven't been here for a long time because of the rate of speed that they'd be going. I don't know. That was just like something I used to think. So that's kind of a conspiracy. But I used to think, I'm trying to think of some other, like JFK, I definitely used to think was,
So what stopped you with JFK? Because that's when a lot of people believe that there's some kind of second shooter or whatever there. Like, how did you?
Well, I don't. I don't know if I just am neutral at this point, because I tend to think that, for one, the most likely thing in the JFK story is probably the actual story. Especially now that they've released all these documents, because it seems like a lot of government resources went into trying to figure out what the answer was, especially with the CIA. And so that makes the most sense to me. But I mean, who knows? It's like I guess I can't be totally 100% confident. I also think that it was really strange that JFK was trying to go back to the silver standard, and like, I think that was kind of, I mean, I'm not as versed on this probably as you are, but I think
I think it was actually a real thing.
Oh, really? Okay.
It was kind of a misreading of a certain executive order that he had.
Fair enough. Yeah. See, so I'm wrong. And that's probably.
It was never on the silver standard, I don't think. It was the gold standard.
Gold standard, yeah. We were always on the gold standard. I actually have a dollar bill from when JFK was president. That's a silver currency note that doesn't have the Federal Reserve on it. But regardless of that, I think that for me, it just seems like it makes sense that, there's a guy that wanted to kill the president, and it wasn't looked at. Like, it just seems, it's kind of like with 9/11. It makes sense to me that in a time when security wasn't what it is now, these people who want to take jihad out on the United States, like, that's their goal. They probably trained and probably figured out a way to do it. Doesn't seem that unlikely to me. So I don't know. It's like, same thing I told you with 9/11. It's like, I don't know for 100% sure either way, but I tend to think that the most logical thing, I just can't bring myself to believe that there's all these government agencies working together to try to kill. If the government wanted to just go to war, I don't think that they would have any problem just saying, hey, we're going to go to war. And,
you know, I think that's one of the biggest things about the 9/11 thing is that it really doesn't make any sense if you think of the scale of what actually happened, like the things that they would actually have to do
right.
to make it happen. The way that the controlled demolition conspiracy theory is they have to pre-wire these two enormous buildings with explosives, three buildings, because there's the building 7 as well.
Right.
And then they would have to get the planes to fly into them at exactly the right spot. And then they would have to make sure that the planes didn't destroy the explosives on those floors.
Yeah.
And then they would have to set off the explosives on the same floors that the plane hit.
Yeah.
It all has to work perfectly, 100%. And
coming from the government, they can't.
If you've ever been involved in any large project of any sort, the chances of it actually working are so small. Like you'd maybe get a 1 in 100 chance, if you're lucky, of it all going perfectly according to plan and nothing being discovered. So if one of them didn't work, then you're left with these buildings that have got all these explosives rigs in them, and they're going to be revealed. So the risk isn't worth the reward. I mean, like you say, if they wanted to go to war, they could do something far, far simpler.
Right.
Just set off a single bomb in the capital or something like that, and that would have been enough.
Or just said that they were planning an attack. I mean, they don't even need to pull an attack off. They could say that they had weapons of mass destruction,
which is that's what they did essentially.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. That's happened before. It's not like that's an unlikely possibility.
Yeah.
And
why would they have bin Laden do it and then invade Afghanistan? They didn't want to invade Afghanistan. Afghanistan's completely messed up. There's no benefit to being in Afghanistan.
And then you have all the, like the conspiracy keeps on getting deeper, because then you have, it's because they wanted the heroin in the poppy fields and all this stuff. And it's
you can always come up with reasons. That's the thing.
I know.
Like if you're trying to explain something, you can always come up with a reason for it.
Right.
If you step back from that and you stop trying to come up with a reason and think, what is a sensible explanation for this? If our options were they had these remote control magical planes that flew into the buildings and flew a missile into the Pentagon without anybody noticing, just so they could corner the market in opium, benefit. I mean, it's sure. Maybe afterwards they thought, let's go in there, and maybe some bad actors in the CIA thought like we could go and do something with the opium now that we have this excuse.
Well, that's what I was going to say next. I think one of the things that made me, you asked me earlier what the thing that made me step away from it is, and one of the biggest things was realizing, once I started to look at things a little bit more objectively, it was almost like I took off this pair of glasses that I was seeing the world through, and I could step back and just be like, and it was almost like, I don't know if you've ever been fooled by anything before, but it's like when you're I know, right? But when you're looking at something a certain way, and then you see it the alternative way, it's like just your whole perception of reality almost changes. It's like you're able to really look at things objectively. I was vegan at one point, and when I stopped being vegan for health reasons, it was like I started to realize I needed to eat meat, and all of a sudden, this whole ideology of what I was doing just fell apart, and it was, I don't know if it's because I convinced myself to eat meat, or if it was because there was stuff I was really genuinely overlooking, and I tend to think it was the latter,
Yeah, well, I think people, when they do escape the rabbit hole, essentially, when they get out of things like conspiracies, they do often have this, quite, precipitous change in the way they think about things. Right. They all of a sudden, all these new possibilities rush in. It's like their eyes were opened, and it's actually kind of similar to when they fall down the rabbit hole.
Right.
In the first place, they start out watching some video on YouTube, like Loose Change or something like that, and then they go like, what the hell is going on? And then they feel like their eyes have been opened, and they go down that rabbit hole, and it takes it's a long way down, and then it's often a long way back out again. But when they do get out, in some ways, it's similar to getting in that they have this revelation and they think they can. But except when they do get out, they actually are thinking more clearly. They're not simply watching more and more YouTube videos and agreeing with what they're seeing. They're actually doing real research.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like I don't. Did you ever watch that loose change debate with the loose change guys and popular mechanics guys?
I don't think so. It would have been a while ago, though. I think.
Yeah, it was in 2005 that the debate happened, but it's on YouTube. But I just watched that this morning to kind of prepare for our conversation. Right. And oh my goodness, like when you watch it, there are these little kids who it's like, it's an ideology. And these guys are like, no, we've talked to these experts in the field and they're like, no, you haven't, you're a liar. And that's the response, it's like, instead of taking a step back and saying, hey guys, I know that you've talked to experts in the field, but we have as well. Or, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not from a real.
Well, they think popular mechanics is part of the cover up. So, that's the problem. It's like, if people have an adversarial outlook in the discussion, they're not going to get anywhere. Like if someone talks to me and they're a 9/11 truther, they think, you're a debunker, therefore everything you say is a lie, you're a shill. So it makes communication very difficult. And you got to break through that to actually make any progress.
Yeah, I'm sure when because I am kind of like an atheist. I don't like to put myself in a box, but I'm definitely I really enjoy that way of just not, I mean, like, I don't know how to, like, I don't like to claim myself as that just to put myself in a box, but obviously that's what I am. And so a lot of times I have friends or family that are religious, and I've actually had friends try to say that I was like possessed, like that the evil, is in me, like trying to change their minds or whatever. And I'm like, I'm not trying to change your mind. I would rather you think more rationally about this subject, because it opens a lot of doors as far as the beauty of life. When you realize like evolution and like the complexity that is what we are now and how it happened, it's beautiful. Yeah. And it's almost like, amazing. It's almost like you're taking away from that and putting this like really simplistic, but it ends up being more complex, because evolution is actually really simple when you think about it. It's not hard to get from here to here when you have millions of years. Yeah,
but then they'll trot out things like the eyeball. How does the eyeball evolve? And if you're not familiar with these things, arguments like that can be quite compelling. Mm-hmm. You could say like, what's the use of half an eyeball? That's not very useful.
Well, but there's have been tons of different phases of the eyeball. I mean, there's obviously ours are the most complex at this point. Or ours aren't the most complex, actually. Ours are relatively poor compared to birds and stuff like that. But I mean, the fact that we can see three-dimensional objects, but there's been like, what are those, the spiral, those things I think had eyes. I can't think of what they're called right now.
Cephalopods?
Yeah, didn't they have like eyes, but just to see shadows? Like they could
like cone eyes.
Cone eyes.
Eyes have actually evolved, I think, something like 15 different times in 15 different ways. Mm-hmm. So there's the eyes of things like shellfish have been no actual biological link between our eyes and their eyes.
Right.
They actually evolved completely separately, and they all evolve the same way. It's like a patch of skin that is sensitive to light, so they can see when it's light or dark. And then things like if a fish goes over you, it gets dark, and so you scurry away. You can tell when the sun's up, you can tell which way up is up and which way is down, and then it gets more and more useful. Right. The thing folds around the eye, and that just makes it more useful because you can tell direction, and then lens forms via various other processes, and it takes like billions of iterations. But the thing is, like, this is well understood science,
right? But when there's experts that go to school for decades to learn this stuff,
and they study in great depth all of these stages of the eye and how they could have evolved, and all these intermediate forms that exist in both fossils and in living animals still. There's animals that have very, very simple eyes like that patch of skin. So there's a vast amount of information about that. But when you talk to someone who doesn't believe in evolution, they just boil it down to a simple, oh, well, what's the use of half an eye? And a lot of the time, they're not really interested in finding out what is the use of half the eye. They're just using that as an argument. And that's something you see in other conspiracy theories. People really aren't that interested in hearing the detailed explanations. And if you start trying to explain it to them, they either will just shut you down, or they won't bother listening because it's a little bit too complicated, too much work. They'd rather just say things like, "Oh, the buildings fell at free fall speed and broke the Newton's laws of motion," and then
which is really funny because you can see things outside of the buildings falling faster than the buildings.
Yes.
So it's like when you watch the video, that doesn't even make sense because you can literally see things falling at free fall speed right next to it.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to point out to people. And there's lots of things like that. You can point out that when the building collapsed, that the core of the building, half of it was still remaining after the building had hit the ground, and then that fell down afterwards. So it wasn't the case of the top part of the building destroying the bottom part of the building. It was the top part of the building breaking up and stripping away the building from the core, and then the core collapsed. But people, they're so stuck on the simple thing, like saying, what's the use of half the eye, or it fell at free fall speed, that when you try to deviate from that, then they just will kind of keep gravitating back to that one thing and saying, what about this? Why did it fall at free fall speed? And they're not really interested in hearing the explanation.
Yeah, it's another thing that I find to be really interesting. This is what I was going to say earlier, is there's like these levels of conspiracy theories, like where like maybe this conspiracy theorist thinks that 9/11's real, but could never, like what I was, I guess, but could never think that, the earth is flat. Or maybe someone thinks this and they think that, the government's lying about going to the moon landings, but this one's too extreme. And so you have all these different gradients of conspiracy theorists. And
actually, I talk about that in my book. I've got a diagram of what I call the conspiracy spectrum. Let me just try and find it here. Where there are more extreme versions of each conspiracy theory, and like different conspiracies are relative to each other. You probably can't see it, but like there's
I see.
Yeah, it's the conspiracy spectrum, and there's things like JFK's down in the simple end, and then the flat Earth is down at the other end, and then they have different ranges. So different conspiracies have different things. But then the thing that arises from that is the concept of a demarcation line, where everybody has a line beyond which everything on one side of the line is sensible stuff, essentially science from their point of view, and everything on the other side of the line is nonsense and disinformation. And if you look, like, say, a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, they think, it's just simple science that the buildings were brought down by explosives because you can see these puffs of smoke and the free fall speed, etc. But they draw the line at something like a missile hitting the Pentagon. Or they might draw the line just on the other side of the missile hitting the Pentagon, and they're drawing the line with chemtrails, or they might draw the line with something like energy beams from space. So they think that everything on one side is just really straightforward, simple science, and everything on the other side is complete bullshit, like made up stuff, disinformation, like CIA mind-altering propaganda. But looking at this point where people draw the line is a very important way of understanding people and communicating with them.
Yeah, I mean, so in your opinion, as someone who's like objective and clearly like for
no one's completely objective,
of course,
we all have biases.
So would you say that you bias more towards like no conspiracy, or do you think that it's possible that some of these like so with 9/11, for example, I don't think it could be possibly as black and white as it's a conspiracy or it's not a conspiracy. I think it could be that there was a terrible event that happened, but the government or these private corporations afterwards seeked out opportunities from a bad situation. And that's why it looks so shady, is because when you look at these organizations that have profited so heavily from these attacks, and then you're like, well, it seems like it could be an inside job when you look at that, but it's very possible that these organizations just were like, hey, let's make some money, and
it's like
I would be guilty of that,
Yeah, if it had happened exactly as the government said it happened, which is probably more or less how it did happen, then what would these people do afterwards?
Right.
There's the thing that conspiracy theorists bring up a lot is the Project for a New American Century, which had a paper someone wrote in it that said they wanted a new Pearl Harbor. Not that didn't say they wanted a new Pearl Harbor. It said what America needs is a new Pearl Harbor.
Wasn't that Cheney?
Sorry?
Wasn't that Cheney that wrote that? Or
no, I think it was maybe Wolfowitz or someone like that.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure exactly who wrote it. It wasn't Cheney though.
Okay.
I'm not sure. But anyway, someone in that group of people, the New American Century people, they're talking about how they want America to be like a world leader, and they say it's going to be difficult if we don't have some kind of big event. And then, a few years later, there was this big event.
Right. But I mean, anything could be calculated as a big event, right?
Yeah, but that was a pretty big one. Yeah. 9/11 was, it's not like just one big event. It's been the biggest event in the last 20 years, I would say. If not more than that. But they took advantage of it. And they were going to take advantage of it because of what they wrote about before, but it doesn't mean that they actually planned it.
Right.
If you're a suspicious person who thinks that that's what the government does, then you're going to leap on, this is saying, they wanted a big event. A big event happened, therefore that means that it happened. But, they could have been saying like, we wanted to hit the Earth, and then one hit the Earth 2 months later. It doesn't mean that they planned it.
Right.
That was the type of thing that they thought would be good for the economy.
Yeah, that was one of the funny things that my friend or coworker that's the flat earther, I asked him about asteroids or meteors or any space material that comes in, and he said that, I don't know, maybe they're throwing rocks out of a plane. And I was like, wow, they have fast pitch pitchers up there throwing rocks, because that's
it. You can come up with an explanation. If you're not going to stump him because he knows he's right. He's got this unshakable belief. He's got this religious belief. And because he knows he is right, it doesn't really matter what arguments you give him. He's going to come up with some explanation, and he'll give you a response. It doesn't matter how ridiculous it is. He's given the response. Like if you say, why do ships go over the horizon? And he'll say, it's perspective. And even though that makes no sense, because it's an explanation in his mind, it's some words that he can give to you in response. He's just going to stick with that because he's got no option really. He has to go with something. So he just makes stuff up basically.
Have you heard a good explanation from the flat Earth community as to why there are seasons and why Alaska stays day all the time and night all the time during certain parts of the year?
Well, it's not really a good explanation.
Of course not.
They give the explanation of the Earth is just a flat disk, and the sun rotates around it. So the North Pole is the center of this disk, and the sun rotates around the equator, which is a line halfway between the middle and the edge. And in the summer, it's closer to the North Pole, and in the winter, it's closer to the edge of the disk, which somehow becomes the South Pole. So that's their explanation for why there are seasons. But when you actually start to break that down and think about where is it actually got to be sunlight and where is it got to be dark, you end up with these really weird shapes of how it actually stays. Sunlight. Like if you think about the North Pole, that's not too complicated.
Right.
You think the sun is close to the North Pole, and so it's got this little spotlight of light that goes around, and a bit of it overlaps the North Pole, so that stays light all the time. But then you come to the South Pole, which is a big ring around the bottom of the outside of the disk, and then in the summer or our winter, the Southern Hemisphere summer, the South Pole has to stay light all the time, which means the light has to go all the way
fast
around the entire disk.
Yeah.
And so it's really, you have to come up with this bizarre bendy light explanation.
Yeah. And it has to go so fast around it, right? I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
it has to. Well, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
It doesn't make sense on so many levels that even if you start trying to debunk something like that, you have to kind of accept a whole bunch of things that are complete nonsense anyway. Like, why is South America like 20,000 miles away from Australia on the flat disk when actually it's only like 6,000 miles away if you go straight over the South Pole, and you can fly from Santiago, Chile to Melbourne, Australia.
Well, and that's another thing I always hear them say is that you can't go to Antarctica. And I know someone that was a cook in Antarctica. Like he cooked, and like, he's not lying to me. There's no reason to lie to me. And I mean, some of the stories he came back with are fucking crazy. Yeah. But I mean, regardless of that, like he thought that it doesn't matter. But then when you hear like people say, oh, you can't go to Antarctica, you can't go. And there's been plenty of explorers that have gone there, and you can take commercial flights from Australia just to see Antarctica. They actually have a commercial airline that's like a vacation where you can fly on it and go see it.
Mm-hmm. You can, if you really wanted to, you could go on the stations where you actually go to the South Pole.
Right.
If you could pay enough money, you can actually go there. It's a pretty strenuous thing. You've got to you fly down to South America first, and then you go from there, and then you land at the ice shelf, and then you take a snowcat across the plane along the ice road. But you can do it if you wanted to, if you actually really wanted to. And people did it. If you look on YouTube, there's loads of videos of people who have done Antarctica exploration, just kind of touristy type stuff, basically.
Right.
Extreme tourism, but people can do it. So it doesn't make any sense. But of course, they'll just say, "Oh, well, that's just all propaganda." If they think
all
that
propaganda.
the satellite pictures are faked.
Well, it was like I was listening to the Jeranism guy. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah. I was listening to him on another podcast, kind of preparing for ours. And he was saying that like Sandy Hook was fake. And on the podcast, someone said, like, I know people in Connecticut that this has affected their family. And he was like, prove it. And it's like, you're going to make me bring you a grieving parent to try to prove to you that Sandy Hook is fake, and he's like, well, you can't do it. And I'm just thinking, like, I feel like in a certain way, at a certain point with things like that, it should always go in you should always give the benefit to the people. You know what I mean?
The victims.
Right. Yeah. I mean, cause I don't know. And so I guess that might bring us to a next. I had someone ask me to talk to you about the Las Vegas shooting. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we can do this really quickly because I think that it's just crazy that people think that was a conspiracy. Like I had someone tell me, well, there's 33 degrees of Mason and he was on the 32nd floor. And I'm like, okay, so was he not a 33rd degree yet or what?
It's like, close enough.
Yeah. So
no, the Las Vegas shooting, it isn't very complicated. It's a crazy guy who decided he was going to go out and take a whole bunch of people with him. And that's really all there is to it. And if you look at what actually happened, there's nothing really complicated there. And you can look at anything and you can find little things like, why did this helicopter take off at this time or whatever, just like tiny little things which you can't immediately explain because you're not actually there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the things that they bring up, like, how did he get all the guns into the room? Like, they think that was very suspicious that he managed to get all these guns into the room. But if you've ever been to Vegas or any city like that has big hotels, you can just bring in your luggage. Mm-hmm. It's not complicated. And now they've released the video that shows them going up in the service elevator with just a big luggage cart with a whole bunch of big suitcases on it.
Right.
People do that type of thing all the time. Like, so some people has lots of suitcases. You don't like demand to search their suitcases just because they have a lot of them. It's
well, it's my wife and I, we make music and stuff. And sometimes when we travel, we bring all of our DJ equipment with us. And so we'll have, huge amounts of stuff with us and we bring them into the hotel. you know,
Yeah,
and
people are going to conventions and they have all the stuff that they need to set up their stands or whatever. They have these large pieces of luggage basically, and there's nothing at all suspicious about it. But the people who are making these claims, they aren't familiar with these things, so they maybe they don't. They're young people who haven't been to Vegas, or they're people who just haven't been in a hotel before and they don't understand how it works.
yeah,
It reminds me of the forest fires thing. Like people think that
yeah,
forest fires are energy beams shot from
yeah,
planes, from
so
satellites.
crazy. It's like,
Uh,
so you're basically saying that a school shooting or a massacre can never happen. Fires
yeah,
can never happen. You know what I mean? It's so like, if those ones are fake, like what happens when there is a real one? Are you never going to think that the real ones aren't possible? I mean, just,
yeah, they think that everything is managed basically. So they think that you get to a stage in this type of belief where you believe every single thing you see on the news is created. So the news is never reporting on real things. So if something real happened, no, the news wouldn't cover it because it wasn't part of the script. So they just think that everything is fake, which makes no sense because like you say, people who are involved in these things. Like you think of
right.
like 9/11. Some people think that no planes hit the World Trade Center, and I tell them I know people who saw the planes hit the World Trade Center, and they say, well, prove it. It's just ridiculous because
Yeah,
there must have been like literally over 10,000 people who saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center, and probably like a couple of thousand who saw the first one, just because it's New York. If you've ever been to New York, it's not
yeah,
something that you could just pretend happened by saying, look over there, and then blowing up the building. It makes no sense
right.
whatsoever. But people somehow fall for these things because they've never been to New York, or they have this weird idea about how things work. It's strange.
So, I think that the Vegas shooter one, we can pretty much just stop talking about that because it's like I don't even know. I didn't even realize that people still thought that was fake. But as
Well,
far
once you
as
start it, it's hard for people to stop thinking it's fake. If people are hardcore believers in that type of thing, you're not going to convince them. It still remains. We don't know why he did it exactly, and
yeah,
I'm sure there's a whole bunch of unanswered questions, which they're just unanswered because we don't have the information, and that doesn't mean anything. It's just meaningless things like why did he do whatever, send this note or whatever. But it's just he was a crazy guy who killed a bunch of people, and that's
yeah,
really
but
all that we can go with.
I mean, why do people rape people? Like rape is something that is to the uppermost limit of sexual experience, I guess. It's like something that someone who's sadistic does to have a sexual encounter. And so it's like, this is like the uppermost limit of this guy's pathology in some way. I mean,
Yeah.
it,
Well, you don't even need to explain it, really.
yeah,
People do crazy things sometimes. And
right.
we know that throughout all of history, there have been mass killers, people who go crazy and they start killing people. There's been mass shootings as long as there have been, guns that could fire fast enough.
Right.
And before that, there were like things where people would try to kill a bunch of other people. So it's not like it's this big mystery as to does this happen?
Right.
Exactly what's going on in their minds as to why it happened. But does it happen? Yes, it obviously does happen. We don't understand exactly why people and any one individual goes crazy and starts shooting people,
But we're
but
learning. I mean,
we know it
that's,
happens.
yeah, that's science though. I mean, we're figuring it out. I think someday we'll probably have the answers to why people do immoral things, or I don't know if you look into like neuroscience, and I don't know what your thoughts are on like free will and frontal cortex and all that weird stuff, but like, I certainly think that we'll have answers for eventually, as long as we continue to live as a species, we're going to have the answers to things like that, like why people do crazy, heinous things. And hopefully we can prevent it just by like reattaching the wires correctly or whatever in the brain, you
Yeah.
know? I mean,
Well,
not,
the next big thing is going to be artificial intelligence.
mhm.
So I think we'll learn a lot about how the human brain works by basically simulating it on computers. So there's going to be progress there. course, the robots are going to take over the world before we get much done there.
So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think do you think that's a kind of a unjustified fear, or?
No, I think it's very justified, and I think it's almost an inevitable thing, just because technology is improving all the time, and we're making robots that can do more and more stuff. It's just a question of when the robots get more intelligent than people, how do you stop them from getting out? Now, if you've got somebody in a computer who's 10 times as intelligent as you, or perhaps like 1,000 times as intelligent as you, trying to figure out how can they essentially get out of the controls of the humans, then don't you think that it's possible that they might actually do it?
Well, I mean, my opinion on it has always been like evolution is obviously like every time that a superior thing takes the next form, like with us, throughout our evolution, I think that if we would have talked to the people 200 years ago about what we've turned into, they probably would have no idea the direction, obviously, that it was headed in, just like we have no idea the direction that this is headed in. But if we determine what consciousness is, and if consciousness is just simply a state of neurobiology, which I tend to think it is, and we can create consciousness, whatever defines consciousness, self-awareness, or whatever that is, into a machine, in my opinion, it would just make the most logical sense that the next form would be something that can't be injured. You don't have to worry about kidney failure, and it's like, that's the next form. Because like, I'm a materialist, so I tend to think that consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain. That's just what I think. I obviously don't know that. But if consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain, then it really doesn't matter what form consciousness takes. It's like humans don't need to be the thing that consciousness lives in, or that so if we can create self-aware consciousness, that could just be the next step of evolution from our planet. And then I don't know,
but it's like, does that mean that we're going to have people there? If we create intelligent computers and robots who are like 2 to 1,000 times as intelligent as we are, they don't need to have people around. So
of course not, but that might not be a bad
the next
thing.
Stage.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. But that I mean, like, we look at it from our perspective, and of course it seems like a bad thing because we're so locked into the idea of being us. But if the next step of evolution is to create something that is that intelligent and does,
but you've got to be practical here. Like, sure, like it'd be great. We're thinking the next step of evolution is these godlike robots. But do you have any children?
No.
Me neither. But like, I've got like a whole bunch of nieces and nephews. So there's the whole next generation, and then there's going to be their children, and then there's going to be their children, and what moving towards a stage of the universe where the robots run everything. If that means like my descendants and my relatives' descendants having to be exterminated, I don't think that's a good thing.
Well, I mean, I agree with you just from a purely emotional standpoint. So when I separate myself from my emotions of wanting to be alive and humans are great and whatever, I am able to recognize that if that's the next step,
right?
That's just,
you got to think of it as two separate things here. There's like the creation of the new race of gods, which is the AI, and then there's the extermination of the human race.
Right.
So there's two things.
Yeah.
One of them's great, like we're creating gods, and the other one's terrible because all the humans are going to die.
Right.
So it's like, do we actually want to be creating gods if it means we've got to kill all the people?
From the same standpoint, though.
Probably not.
Yeah, maybe. But at the same point, I think that we could look at anything as being the next thing that exterminates the human race. Like, what if there's an asteroid that takes it out, or an EMP, or some sort of...
something we can do something about, though. Like, this is something people are actively working on, making these godlike robots. And some other people are working on trying to keep them corralled. but most people are just ignoring it.
Right.
Even
So what do
things like asteroids, we're working on.
what do you think? Well, I mean, asteroids is something. I'm sorry, I think you might have cut out there.
No,
I think like asteroids is something that we're not really working enough on, and that could be
oh yeah,
something that could be detrimental. So it's almost the same thing in a sense. This is something that has obviously been a huge problem in our history and
yeah.
could potentially be the next big problem that we deal with, but nobody really takes the resources to look into that. I mean,
Yeah,
we
I mean,
do a
a
little
lot
bit.
of people think these are the two biggest issues facing humanity is artificial intelligence and asteroids.
Right.
And that's it, because those are the two things that have the possibility of wiping out the human race. Like global warming, it's going to mess up the planet. It's going to,
But we can
Florida's
find
going to
something.
get flooded, but, we can move to higher ground. It'll be a terrible disaster, but we won't all be dead. We'll be able to survive to some degree as a civilization. So, global warming is a terrible thing. But
Right.
compared to like an asteroid hitting the Earth or, godlike robots rising up and exterminating us, it's something we can deal with. So, people put those two things, AI and and asteroid impact, as being the biggest problems. And like you said, they're not really being looked at because the things that are way off in the future or fairly unlikely. But
Mm-hmm.
asteroids hit the Earth every like 10,000 years or so.
Yeah, and meteorites every day. But I guess, so what do you think the best thing to do about this is then? Do you think that we should be hitting the brakes, or you're a technology guy, obviously, that's how you
Yeah.
made your money. So,
I think, with the AI, I think we should think very carefully about it. And I think we do need governance, that we need a body to actually regulate these things and put measures in place to stop advanced technology escaping from whatever it's in.
how would
It
we do
doesn't.
that?
I
Just
don't
put
know
it like
exactly,
a
but
unplug here
well,
sign, or
yeah,
what?
you make it so it can only work in a certain physical container, for example.
Hmm.
You don't make it so you can just upload it to the internet and have it live in the cloud,
Right.
work anywhere. It has to have some kind of physical thing, and there has to be perhaps some physical off switch, essentially, that you can do.
Hmm.
And we got to work on things like, I don't know if you know the iRobot story. It has the prime, not the prime directives, but the three laws of robotics that must never allow a robot must never allow any human to come to harm, and a robot must always obey a human, and a robot must I can't remember what the third one is, protect itself. And it's got these things that are rigorously built into robots. That the first thing a robot must ever do when it thinks about what it's going to do next is, will this hurt a human? And that's something that has to be a fundamental part of robots. And right now it's not. Robots
Yeah.
exist. If you go into a factory and you see the robots like building cars with these big arms that swing around and they'll take your head off
Right.
because they don't have anything, because they can't walk around, so it's not really a big deal. But when robots can start to actually walk around, and when cars are driving themselves and trucks are driving themselves, and when robots are flying planes, and when robots are engaged in warfare, that's a
Mhm.
tricky one, because then you've got robots designed to kill humans.
Yeah, that is a whole, I mean, that's definitely, I mean, I think the military and war in general is something that is just so ridiculous, but to introduce potentially sentient
Mm-hmm.
machines, that's like a whole
But
next
then, if the other side is doing it, you have to do it too. It's kind
yeah,
of like the nuclear arms race.
which is why we
Uh,
need to become an NWO, Mick West, so that we can, I'm just kidding.
well, it's why we need a robotic warfare treaty.
Yeah.
We have nuclear arms treaty that stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We want to stop the proliferation of robot weapons. If you like right now, you could probably build a drone swarm that could fly into the Capitol and take out everybody, all the senators.
Right.
It wouldn't be incredibly difficult. It would require a bunch of resources, but if another state wanted to do that, they could essentially send in a little swarm that we don't have any current defenses for, And because there's this very rapid escalation in the technology, it makes it very, very dangerous, and it makes it very destabilizing for the geopolitical situation. If one side come up with some kind of really good way of killing people with robots, and the other side doesn't have it, then it's like one side having nuclear weapons and the other side not having nuclear weapons. It could be a very bad thing, and we need to look at it.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly think that it's like, I just think that it's just something we're going to figure out, and either we're going to kill ourselves or not, I guess, you know what I mean? Yeah. So I do agree with you. I think that it's something that we should try to put some sort of precautionary measures into, but I just don't see how. I can't imagine any other like sentient beings like cows trying to tell us like, hey, you're really fucking with my species right now, please stop, and us listen, you know. And so for the same thing with robotics, I just don't see how, but I do think it's an inevitable part of our next journey. I just don't I don't see any other way. It's obvious. We've got tons of corporations investing tons of money into it. It's not going to stop. There's no way. But I also rationally can't see how, I mean, us as humans, it's a huge desire to be able to be like, please don't hurt us, you know. But I almost think that's an irrational way of looking at it, because I just don't see how we could possibly try to control that.
Well, I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
There's some interesting things happening in the next 20 years.
Yeah, no kidding. Do you think, how far away do you think, like general intelligence could be?
10 years.
Yeah.
I think within 10 years, you'll have something that's indistinguishable from a human, something that you pass the Turing test, where you can hold a conversation. And, once you're at the stage of being as intelligent as a human, then, it's
all up from there.
After that.
Yeah.
10 years after that, you're going to have something that's much more intelligent than a human, just because you've got these things running on like Google's cloud. It has say 1 million computers, like very powerful computers. Like you've got your computer on your desk right now, that times 1 million in terms of its processing power and its ability to look things up on the internet and make connections and learn.
Wow.
So it's inevitable that we're going to get this. People have been saying this for a long time, but now we're actually getting to the stage where you can actually hold a conversation with a computer. Like the speech recognition is pretty good. We've got these generative adversarial networks, which is a way of computers teaching themselves things very, very rapidly, how to do certain things, and they work really, really well. And you've got things like Alibaba is a Chinese version of Amazon, and they've just released an AI assistant, basically, that you can talk to on the phone. And for most people, they wouldn't be able to tell, how that it's their computer. And the thing is that they automatically get literally millions of people teaching it how to be a human, because they put it in their customer support.
Right.
And so they have this computer learning how to be a human by doing customer support and talking to people. And it's learning right now at a level that's less than a human baby, but it's learning 1 million times at once. So wow. It's not going to be long.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you personally think that consciousness is just a byproduct of like neurobiology?
I think it's an irrelevant question, and I don't really think there's much point wasting time on it. It's like, is the universe a simulation? It's an interesting question, but from a practical basis of your daily life, it's probably not going to impact you. If someone figures out that we're running in a simulation and you can't do anything about it, then what difference does it make? If they figure out that they're running in a simulation and they can do something about it, then that would be very, very interesting indeed. But the chances of that seem unlikely.
I agree with you on. Yeah, I totally agree with you 100% on that the simulation one, I never even really cared to think about it. It's just like I think that there has to be a first one, and it makes the most sense that we are the first. I mean, but once again, that's just me thinking too logically maybe. But I guess with the consciousness thing though, that does have a lot of implications to the day-to-day life, knowing that in a way, because if it is just the result of our brain making connections and synapse and stuff like that, I mean, to me, it's like, what is consciousness? Consciousness is being self-aware, but it's also, like there's levels. Like a dog might be conscious, but they might not be as self-aware and motivated by the same things that we are, but humans are conscious to a different point. So our motivations come in from all these different areas. And if it is just a byproduct of the brain, the things that motivate you could just be like your hunger. Like maybe you're hungry for something, and that's creating you to have a certain attitude towards something, which is, going to impact your next movement and how you communicate with other people. And I guess the reason why I think that this is related to AI is because it seems like if consciousness is just a result of our biology, and us being self-aware is just a better way of surviving, then it wouldn't make sense that a computer would want to be motivated by the same intentions that we are, because it seems like our intentions are just survival based.
Yeah, well, you've got the hierarchy of needs, where it's people want to have food and shelter. Well, people need to breathe first off, and then they need to be not very cold and not very hot, and then they need to be not thirsty, and then they need to have shelter, and then they need to have companions, and then they need to have children, and then they need to make things, and then they need to write books. So there's this hierarchy of things that people need. It's not just like one simple thing, which is survival. But for a computer, it might be. Computers might be programmed so that the only thing that it really cares about is surviving. And the computers, just because we make general intelligence, it doesn't mean that we are going to program it so its motivations arise from nothingness. Right. When you build something, when people build robots, they're going to put motivations in there.
Okay.
And we have motivations about what we're going to do that are based on our biology. I'm motivated to drink water because I am thirsty. I'm motivated you put your jacket on earlier because you were cold.
Right.
You weren't doing that because of some grand plan. That was just your body telling you, I'm cold, and you thought, I'll put your jacket on.
I agree. But I think
you might have put that aside and said, I don't want to put my jacket on because it'll look bad on video. And that's like you're using your intellect to override your physical needs.
And I did that several times before I put it on.
but eventually your physical needs will always win out. But for a computer, they don't have bodies. So what's the base motivation of a computer? Someone's got to program something into the computer so it has a motivation, or you let a motivation arise randomly. People program computers to play games, and they give the computer a goal of playing some video game, and the computer tries to play that video game. If you tell the computer you've got to survive, then the computer might figure out, I could survive a lot better without all these people around.
Yeah.
So don't expect them to be anything like people, because they're not.
Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, though, is part of the reason why I think that it's kind of like, I definitely think that we're like running towards the edge of the cliff with this thing. And I think that we're kind of doing it with blindfolds on, in a way. But I also think that no matter what we program into it, I mean, I'm not a programmer, so it's really hard for me to talk about this, but no matter what we program into it, it seems, I just can't see where the motivations would come from to exterminate the humans, unless it was part of the programming that was written into it. Because it's
it's like I said, though, like if they are programmed just to survive,
right, and
they're programmed to think about what is the best way of surviving, and they think that I want to have more of me, so that they want to survive and multiply. That's their directive. They don't just suddenly think, I'll destroy all the humans because it'd be cool. They think that on balance, if I destroy all the humans, there's a lot more resources on the earth for me.
Right.
So it's
But
not
what would
anything complicated. It's not
yeah,
like you know, they're not people. These robots. They're just things with they can have a driving force, and if they don't have some balancing driving force programmed in, like don't kill people, then they're going to kill people
yeah,
if it's convenient and if they can. So it's, you know, you say like you don't see why they would kill people. Well, they would kill people so they can have more resources. They would kill people because people are always threatening to switch them off. They would kill people because, you know,
mm.
people are distracting and annoying.
Yeah. I guess
Yeah,
that would be. I mean, that'd be why I would do it if I was a robot.
yeah.
I'm just kidding.
You're an all powerful thing. So yeah, it's not something that's unlikely to arise. It's something that we actually have to actively stop happening. Otherwise, it will happen.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not going
I
to do it. So I came
yeah.
up programming years ago.
I know. I have listened to very little debates about this or talks about this. I have listened to Steven Pinker talk about it, and I kind of tend to be a little bit more on that wavelength, I think, where it's just like it's probably inevitable. We're of course our part of survival is always going to be motivated. We're motivated by not dying, because that's what survival is not dying in order to pass on copies of the genes. So it's like we're always going to look at the fear things as a huge thing for us. But well, I guess we just won't know until it happens. So it's hard to have the discussion. But
One little story.
mhm.
In the, I think the late 90s, there was a thing called mad cow disease
Right.
in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And we figured out that the cows, we've been feeding cows their own brains, and
Right.
they had this disease. And we figured out the best way to deal with this problem was to kill all the cows. So they
Yeah.
killed all of the cows of like the main types of cows that they had in Britain. Killed
Yeah.
every single one of them. It was like 20 million cows or something like that.
Yeah.
Killed them all.
Yeah. They've
Just
done
because it was
similar
the
things with
simple,
deers and elk, right?
it was the simple rational thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't care that much about cows. Some people do, but yeah, most people don't really care. It was sad we had to kill all these cows, but
Right.
we had these huge bonfires of burning cows. And
Jeez.
it was terrible. It was a cowpocalypse. But
Yeah.
you know, we are to cows as computers are to us.
Yeah.
So if computers rationalize that, you know, people are kind of like this virus who is messing with them, and they better get rid of them, then they're just gonna stick us all in a big pile of bonfires and set fire to us, just like we did to the cows.
Or maybe they'll just be like, fuck this planet. We can go live on Mars because we don't require oxygen or whatever. So, but I don't
Yeah,
know.
well,
I mean,
we'll see.
yeah, I know it's going to be interesting. And I'm really glad that we get to experience it. Cause I think, I mean, the thing is, I think that in every point of history, it seems like, you know, the next big invention has been something. I mean, look at Y2K. That was like something where it's like, what happens when Y2K happens, and it's gonna destroy all the banking systems, and you know, but it ended up just being another day. And so I think, I mean, but once again, I guess I'm just trying to be a little bit more optimistic about it. I think that you're probably right. There's a lot of things that we have to fear with it, but it's also really beautiful in a way. I mean, this could be the next thing. And if we end up going extinct, chances are eventually we are going to anyways. So it's gloomy to think about, but it is true. I mean, what's the other option? There's going to be a day when just, even if you don't think that it's when the sun burns out, maybe we get to other planets, there's going to be a day when the universe, you know, expands to the point of whatever. So,
well, I'd like to see people still around to do that, like my descendants.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, not just some mindless robots,
but
which will be
according to
mindless,
you,
but they won't be humans. They're not going to be the same. So if humans die, then I think the
well,
universe.
if they're conscious though, if they're totally self-aware and conscious, wouldn't that be what the mind is? I mean, don't you think? You just don't think so?
All psychopaths.
Yeah.
I mean, you no doubt have a beautiful mind and have beautiful thoughts, but a lot of people don't.
Right.
It could be just these incredibly evil psychopathic robots running the world, because they're the ones who are best at, you know, what if they were all Donald Trump type robots?
That would be a really scary world.
Donald Trump, but 10,000 times more powerful. So it's you know, I think it's great to think that they would be these wonderful, beautiful creatures, but they could also be these demonic creatures who
Totally.
care nothing about anything rather than surviving.
Right.
So,
Okay. Well, I think that I think you and I should definitely talk about this again in 6 months or something. But I have a
let's
couple
see
more
what happens.
questions I wanted to run by you.
Sure.
First is vaccines. You know, I that's obviously a huge one that people are
Mm,
always afraid of. And
yeah.
that was one of the ones that I was actually I guess conspiratorially minded towards. I never got vaccines before. And then real recently, like within the last year, I started to recognize, I mean, I started doing a bunch of research on it. And then like you look at polio being completely pretty much eradicated by vaccines. And the guy that invented the polio vaccine first tested on himself, which is like,
Hmm.
you know, obviously if you're creating some diabolical plan, you're not going to run it on yourself and your family first. But what do you think about vaccines? You think they're
I
just
think they're
great,
great. I
great
think
modern invention?
they are. They've basically wiped out a lot of diseases, and they work very well, and they don't cause autism. You know, this
Yeah,
is
no
the big
kidding.
thing that people talk about, and there's been hundreds and hundreds of studies
Hmm.
that show that there is no link between vaccines and autism. And these are studies that involve hundreds and hundreds of thousands of test subjects, and they look at the rates of autism in certain populations, the rates of vaccinations in those populations, and they see, is there any correlation? And the answer is no, there isn't.
Yeah. Do you
Uh,
think that it could be on, not to get away from vaccines too much, but do you think with the autism thing, there could be a correlation between the gut brain axis and diet?
I don't really know. I mean, I know that there's been an increase in diagnosed autism.
Hmm.
I think a lot of that is due to better diagnosis. But
Hmm.
there are things going on in the environment that
Yeah,
are having an effect on people.
absolutely. I think food
Like,
is a huge one too, but
yeah, diet has definitely changed over the last 200 years or whatever, even over the last 50 years.
even over the
Uh,
last 10,000, because I mean, that's, you know, like
hmm,
10,000 years in evolutionary terms isn't that long. But I
yeah,
just was reading an article about how they started to find out there was just I think it was a peer-reviewed paper that was just published about Parkinson's and there being a gut-brain axis. Did you see that?
no,
Okay.
but I'd be very cautious about papers like that, because there's a lot of times a single paper gets published on
Of
something,
course. Yeah.
and it turns out to be either not very good quality,
Mhm.
or there's some mistake in what they do. So you need more than one paper.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the thing
I
that's
agree with you 100% on that. I just think that I think that there's probably, I mean, I have Crohn's disease. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but, um,
yeah,
and so for the last couple of years, I've been fighting it pretty hardcore. And then real recently, within the last 6 months, I started I went like really deep into figuring out a diet that works for me. And I fasted for a while and I've completely eradicated it with no medication. And
right.
I'm not against medication.
Mm.
There was a point where I got into the medication for it, but it just wasn't doing it. It wasn't actually curing the symptoms. And so for me, I had to find something else.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a
But
lot we don't know about diet and how it
mhm,
affects people, just because it's such a hard thing to study.
yeah,
It's difficult. You
so
can look at
variable.
what people have done,
Mhm,
what people's diets are as they report them, but it is difficult because there's, like you said, there's so many different variables.
mhm.
People do things like they go to an all beef diet. Right?
Right.
All they
That's
eat
just
is like
crazy.
roast beef, and they
Mhm,
seem fine right now, but who knows
yeah.
what's happening to them down the road.
Yeah, and
Uh,
that whole thing has turned into a religion in itself. I mean,
yeah, and
it's like,
all these diets do, like,
yeah,
they're called fad diets for a reason, in that
right.
any diet will work because generally it's reducing your calories because you're eating something like cabbage or whatever. That
Well, and also you're being mindful about what you're putting in your body.
Mhm.
I mean, that was like I went vegan. I was vegan for almost 4 years, and when I first did it, before that I was eating fast food and drinking shit energy drinks and doing all
Yeah,
these different things, and then it was like I went vegan and I started to feel amazing, but I was also eating fresh, local,
right.
organic, whatever, and so it was like all this like good food, and all of a sudden I felt great, but I wasn't even considering the fact that it wasn't the fact that I had reduced my diet down to veganism, it was because I was eating.
Yeah, you made a lot of changes, and that's the thing. Like, you know, like I said, lots of variables, and you changed like 10 variables at the same time. So it wasn't just this one thing.
Right.
Yeah, vegan food is great, and it's very tasty. I like vegan food.
Yeah, me too.
But I eat meat.
Me too.
I don't eat very much fast food anymore, and
nor do I.
Yeah, I've never really had any major diet problems.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's a complicated subject.
It is, and it's so everybody's so different. I mean, and I think that to get back to the vaccine thing, it's like this is something that with the vaccines, it's like people will have a negative experience with them, and they'll go on a social media rampage. And because one person out of however many thousands has a negative experience, it's like the light gets shined on that one person, because it is scary, but it's also extremely rare. I mean, what is it, like 99.9% of people don't have, or something crazy like that? It's like very limited amount of people have adverse side effects, right?
Yeah, definitely. And you know, the vaccine scare was the modern one was started by Andrew Wakefield, who published this paper that has since been retracted
and debunked.
He's lost his medical license, and he actually he basically now he's on the conspiracy circuit. He was on the conspiracy cruise of, I think, 2016.
There's a cruise?
An actual thing. It's a cruise ship. Where they don't take the whole ship, but they hold a convention on a cruise ship, and they have a bunch of people who believe in chemtrails and 9/11 and stuff like that. And Andrew Wakefield was the star of honor on that thing. And it's basically, the whole vaccine thing is a conspiracy theory that's equally as ridiculous when you really get down to the deep belief that they have. Is equally as ridiculous as chemtrails.
Yeah,
and that's who he ends up talking to. If you look, Andrew Wakefield has been on with Dane Wigington. Dane Wigington's the lead guy in the chemtrails movement.
Oh,
and they're good friends, because Dane Wigington, of course, is well on his side of the line, so he definitely believes that vaccines are evil.
Yeah.
Andrew Wakefield is now just a fully fledged conspiracy theorist. I mean, it's not like you dismiss people because they believe in conspiracies, but he's just completely wrong. His study was crap. There was another study that was done with a similar type of thing with GMOs, where they injected some rats with.
Oh, I saw that.
No, they fed them some GMO corn, I believe, and they
got tumors.
It was actually it's a similar sample size of the Wakefield study. It was like 20 rats or something like that, and the type of rats they used were rats that always got tumors. The actual result was completely meaningless, and actually some of the rats that got fed more GMOs actually did a bit better than the ones that only were fed a little bit, which makes no sense whatsoever. But there is terrible little studies that people do, but people latch onto them, and then they think this is the truth because it fits in their worldview, and then they think everything else is a cover-up.
So do you think, though, I mean, so my wife she works at an organic food store. She's like super into that stuff. And I was for a really long time. I'm pretty neutral on it now. Once again, I don't really sit in any hard line, but I think that it is such a new thing that, and this is only going to go for some things, because obviously GMO is a huge blanket term that covers way too many things. Right now it's like you go and get baking soda and it says organic, it's like, you know what I mean? So
I bought some aluminum oxide that said organic.
Yeah,
and aluminum oxide is the chemical. It's basically sand.
Two things. So it's obviously like this huge blanket term right now. And my wife sees it every day. People come into her store and they're just like, oh my gosh, I am so against this now. And can you point me into the right direction for this? And, and it's just, they're right on that boat. And so, but you got to wonder, I mean, do you think that some of the GMO stuff that's going on is going to have negative implications, at least for the environment at a minimum, right? I mean,
well, I think you got to separate into two things. It's like what are these individual genetic modifications that are actually happening, and what are the effect of those? And then is there some deeper problem where if you're editing the genes of something, does it mess things up in a certain way? Does it unravel? Does it start to become toxic?
Mhm.
But like, if you're just inserting a gene into an apple to make it a blue apple instead of a red apple,
Mhm.
there's no reason that's necessarily going to be dangerous. But because it's editing the genes, some people would say that you don't know exactly what you've done to those genes, so it might be dangerous.
Right.
But genes are editing themselves all the
All the
time.
time. Yeah. That's the
They're constantly
funny thing about
changing. Whenever every time DNA like separates and then recombines, there's errors in the transcription. So it's always changing. It's always
it. Right.
evolving.
And that's how
Um,
we come up with better foods sometimes, is when it
yeah,
self replicates and it's in a different way.
yeah. We're using we know that things change, and so we breed whichever one is the best, and so we just keep going in a certain direction, and eventually, wolves turned into chihuahuas.
Right. That's
Uh,
the funny
or,
thing about the whole like GMO, like, march against GMOs and all this stuff, is half those people smoke weed that's been so genetically modified. You know what I mean? It's
yeah,
like weed is all about genetically modifying it,
yeah.
because you're trying
But
to make
in some
flavors.
ways, it's a bit of a misleading argument, I think, because the people who are serious about GMOs uh, understand this. They understand that we have selective breeding and that the genes have changed, and they think there's something specific about editing genes which is different from natural breeding, natural selection. And so you've got to
Well,
really you can't just say, oh yeah, like wolves are turned into chihuahuas, therefore it's safe. You've got to
yeah.
actually address this particular issue, and that's
I
kind of
agree
like,
with you, except for the part where you said most people that are heavily into it, because I think most people that get heavily into any of this
well,
shit don't actually
I mean,
educate themselves.
seriously into it,
Yeah,
as in like they actually study the science behind it rather than
yeah,
just be like, oh, GMOs are a poison.
right.
You know, people can be very like heavily into that, but
Yeah.
they're not really doing any research.
Yeah, it seems like whenever I watch a documentary on this stuff, I walk away just shaking my head, because there's so many. It's just so slanted. And I'm not even that intelligent. Like, I don't even really understand the sciences behind it, but I can hear the things that they're saying, and it's so clear. Like, actually, this is something that someone wanted me to talk to you about, was
Mhm.
things like Monsanto suing farmers for cross pollination, and trying to push out small time farmers. I was wondering if you've ever looked into any of that.
Well, Monsanto is a big corporation, and big corporations don't always have the interests of small people
Hmm.
in mind. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did things that negatively impacted
Hmm.
small people. But big oil corporations do this. They
Right.
take over land and they run pipelines through people's land. The energy companies do things like that. They'll also take over people's land. Corporations, they're kind of like the AI we're talking about in a way. The corporation's reason for existing is to make money for its stockholders,
Right.
or
And it's like
more.
its own entity.
Yeah, yeah. So yes, I think there are probably Monsanto probably has done some bad things in the past, but Monsanto is also comprised of people who are just like you and me.
Right.
I'm not saying like corporations are people too, because they're not. Corporations are nasty, evil AI entities essentially, but they're made of people, and those people have good intentions.
Sometimes.
So
Yeah.
yeah, but just because people work for Monsanto doesn't mean they're evil.
Yeah.
Lots of people in Monsanto are actually doing lots of good work in trying to create types of crops that will feed more people.
Right.
Genetic modification of crops is one of the things that's most likely to increase yields.
Yeah.
Uh, the things that we can do, like increasing the efficiency of photosynthesis in crops, is something that can be done with a bit of gene editing. And if
Yeah.
you increase your crop yields by 10-15%, that's just a huge amount of
Oh yeah.
additional food.
It's
So
crazy.
they're doing great things, but they're also corporations. So they've got the bottom line. So if they find some farmer has been storing seed to replant it, yeah, maybe they'll sue him if they find a farmer that they think was cross-pollinating the crops with a crop in another field, and they think he was doing it deliberately. Then yeah, they might sue him and they might bankrupt him. Yeah, they might do things like that because corporations are mindless, evil entities. But I don't think that they have some kind of plot to take over the world.
Right. It's just
And I don't
people
think they have a
doing
plot to poison
things.
people.
I agree with you. I think that, well, and I mean, let's say, for example, Monsanto really was poisoning people at this point. Let's say that we find out that GMOs are terrible and they do cause cancer and all this stuff. That doesn't mean that that was their intention either. It could very well be that that was a terrible byproduct of whatever.
Maybe we would discover that, but there's no evidence that that's actually happening. If you look at the rates
I agree with you. Yeah.
of death, causes of death, they're not really changing that much.
Right.
I think respiratory disease just overtook, was it, I can't remember what it is, stroke as the third and fourth position leading cause of death. But number one and number two are cancer and heart disease.
Right.
And they account for like 80% of all deaths. People's life expectancy
has gone up tremendously.
It's gone up a lot. It's actually, I think it took a little dip recently. I can't remember why exactly. I think it was perhaps because people are becoming more sedentary. But after people stop smoking and
exactly, that's what I was just going to say. That's, I mean, the thing is it's like a lot of times when I've been speaking with the conspiracy theorists about the government controlling us and trying to kill us and all this stuff, it's while they're smoking a cigarette. And it's like, I guess I think that even if there was this grandiose plan, if everything was all, I mean, obviously I don't think this, but if there was some sort of secret elite people and they're trying to control your minds and all this stuff, it's like the best thing that you can do is just be extremely healthy and take care of yourself and live the best way that you can, because you're going to be happy. That's like,
that would be a good thing to do regardless.
Right.
It doesn't really matter. Like it's like that old joke, like, what if global warming is a huge con and we build a better world mistake? It's like we should be doing these things. We should be getting more renewable energy, and we should be taking more care of ourselves, regardless of whether there's some.
So if that's the thing that motivates you, then yes, the Illuminati is controlling us. But I just think
I don't want people to just gloss it over, because I don't think the Illuminati is controlling us. I think there's no evidence of these things. I
agree with you. I mean, so one of the things you asked me earlier, like what got me out of it, and this is something I want to talk to you about too, because when I was really big into conspiracies and looked into the Rothschild like crazy and the Federal Reserve and fractional reserve banking and all this stuff, it was while I had a serious drug problem. And I've been clean for like almost 3 years now. And something that I realized once I started to get clean was that my paranoia had gone down like crazy. I was looking at things a lot more rationally. And I started to obsess over neuroscience. Like I took a bunch of neuroscience classes because I wanted to see how the drugs had been affecting my judgment in my brain and all this stuff. And so I just started to really look into it. And it seems like for me, this whole, like when I was on the drugs, I was on amphetamines. And so I was extremely paranoid. And like what I think now looking back on it is that I wasn't sleeping very much, and I felt like there were people, like I felt like I was always in fight or flight mode. And that's because, your prefrontal cortex is like shut down pretty much because there's not as much energy to run it and all that stuff. So I felt like I was always in fight or flight. And I think that when you're in fight or flight, your just nature is to try to figure out what reason you're in that state. So then you start to look around and you're like, is that person going to hurt me? Is that why I'm on edge like this? And you're not thinking rationally about how it's because of your lack of sleep and drugs. And so then you start to think that everything is happening for a reason. And like all of these different forces are working together against you because you feel a certain way. So I was wondering if you think that, I mean, this is just my opinion. I have no idea if this is true, but do you think that maybe for other people, it's like a lower grade of that? They're not successful. They're not healthy. They don't feel good because they're not taking care of themselves, because they're not exercising, because they're not eating right. And as a result of this, they feel like people are poisoning them and making them sick. And
yeah, I think there's definitely a component of that. I think you got to start out with discussions like this by saying that everyone is different, and just because we're talking about things like drug abuse or even mental illness, it doesn't mean that's the reason for everybody's being a conspiracy theorist. There's lots of people who never smoked a joint or taken a drink who believe that 9/11 was an inside job. But what you described, that the mental states of being fearful and suspicious, that's the type of thing that leads to paranoia and people thinking irrationally about what's going on around them. Like there's a famous thing about human nature where if you hear something rustling in the bushes,
right,
you could go and investigate it, or you could run away. If it's a wolf, then you go investigate it, you die. If you run away, you
live to see another day.
You live. So evolution favors people who are afraid of things rather than people who are curious about things. So being fearful is kind of like an evolutionary thing. And if you're on drugs, that can kind of reduce your higher level thinking, and so you become more of a primal person, and so these instincts come through, and you're thinking more about self-preservation and about what is there around you that is hurting you. Right. I think there is a huge amount of hypochondria that comes up in conspiracy thinking. A lot of people who are afraid of chemtrails think that chemtrails are poison and that they are being poisoned by them. And people who believe in New World Order type things, a lot of them, there's the old tinfoil hat type thing, but a lot of people actually believe that they're having things beamed into their brains.
Right.
And a lot of the time, it is this type of fear of being contaminated or infected or something like that. There's a famous book called Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas, which talks about how this is this very basic primal thing and how it varies through different cultures. But it's definitely a thing. This fear of infection and contamination and having things done to you. So, I think your thoughts there were along the right track.
Cool. Well, I think that it's such an honor to talk to you. I feel like I could talk to you for another 10 hours, but I'm sure that you have other things to do.
I do.
So what's the name of your book and how can people get it?
Oh, the name of my book is Escaping the Rabbit Hole, and it is available wherever books are sold. So you can get it on Amazon. It's available on hardback, ebook, and audiobook. And it's in Barnes & Noble and places like that too. So.
Okay, and then your website is metabunk.org or com?
Yep. Both will work, but metabunk.org.
Okay. And I just want to thank you again. I really hope that you and I can chat again. I don't know if you'd be interested in doing it again with me, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah, sure. It's probably one of my favorite conversations I've ever had. So,
really?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I thought it was very interesting too.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I'm going to just stop the recording really fast and then give me just 1 second.